So today I wanted to do an overview of the Sorceress class in Diablo 4. Now the Sorceress is going to be a ranged caster with a pretty big focus on massive AoE attacks, also being focused on 3 different elements, those being shock, fire, and frost. And the Sorceress's main resource is going to be mana, which is going to work in a similar way to energy from the rogues, where it continuously regenerates itself, but you're going to have much less control on regenning mana yourself, primarily because your basic skills don't regen any of your resource at a base. And the unique class mechanic for the Sorcerer is going to be enchantment slots, which I think is a deceptively complex class mechanic. And with these enchantment slots, you're able to slot in any non-ultimate skill into them, and then they're going to give you a very strong passive effect based off of what skill is put into these enchantment slots. So once you hit level 15, you get a quest line unlocked, and once you go complete this quest line, you'll unlock the entire system. You'll get your first slot once you complete that quest line, and you'll get your second slot once you hit level 30. And some examples of this is if you put in the fireball skill, you will get when you kill an enemy, they explode in a fireball for 50% of its damage. And this one is really strong, and we actually saw this during some of the public betas, because this is just when you kill any enemy with anything, they basically blow up in an AoE. And with the first public beta, this was probably the strongest build in that beta, was using Hydras that have very good single target damage and using this enchantment slot, meaning anytime your Hydras kill something, they blow up in this AoE. And since they were doing so much single target damage, they'd pretty much just AoE kill everything on a singular kill. And another example is Arc Lash, which is one of your basic skills. When you use a cooldown, enemies around you are stunned for 0.5 seconds. Now this is any cooldown, and since a lot of the Sorcerer skills that don't use a resource have a cooldown, you could be stunning enemies quite a lot with just this one passive effect. Now, Sorcerer skills are going to be split into 6 different categories: basic skills, core skills, defensive skills, conjuration skills, mastery skills, and ultimate skills. And like all the other classes, you can mix and match skills of all of the first 5 categories. So you could use 4 basic skills if you wanted, but you can only use 1 ultimate skill at a time. So similar to the rogue, the Sorcerer basic skills don't generate you any of your main resource, so they're primarily used as fillers or to apply some type of buff to yourself or debuff to an enemy. And an example is Firebolt, lucky a chance of 20%, hurling a flaming bolt dealing damage and burning for more damage over 8 seconds. Now this is actually pretty important because having any burning effect on enemies can actually trigger quite a lot of effects, and there are a ton of different passives and skills throughout the Sorceress's skill set that work with burning effects. And an upgrade for this is Firebolt now pierces through burning enemies. So now even the first upgrade for this also is affected just by burning enemies, and this is any burning enemies applied by anything. So if you use other fire skills that are burning, your Firebolt will also now pierce through them, and since your Firebolt causes burning, all those enemies that it pierces through are also now gonna be burning, just stacking up those effects. And next up we have core skills, which work in basically the same way as every other class. These are going to use your main resource and be some of the most important parts of your build, because so many of the different effects throughout the game are built around core skills. And an example of this is Frozen Orb, mana cost of 40, lucky chance of 20%. Unleash an orb that chills enemies and expels piercing shards, dealing a chunk of damage. Upon expiration, Frozen Orb explodes, dealing more damage and chilling enemies again. Now chilling is just a slow, and if you fully build up a chill, it freezes the enemies, stunning them. So basically you're just throwing out this spinning orb, spins around, throws out these shards to deal damage while slowing enemies, and then it blows up at the end, dealing more damage and chilling enemies even more. And an upgrade for this is when you cast above 50 mana, Frozen Orb's explosive damage is increased by 30%. And this upgrade actually has a little bit more gameplay than you would think, because keeping yourself above 50 mana is actually quite difficult, especially at low levels. But if you're more of an endgame build, you could potentially have a lot more mana, meaning there's going to be some gameplay around keeping yourself above 50 mana while casting these Frozen Orbs to get a pretty large damage increase. And next up, we have the defensive category, all these skills being focused around keeping you alive. And an example is Flame Shield, 20-second cooldown, lucky chance of 50%, engulf yourself in flames for 2 seconds, burning surrounding enemies for damage per second, and while Flame Shield is active, you are immune. Now immune is just completely immune to damage. So this defensive that is incredibly strong because it makes you fully immune to everything is also dealing some decent AoE damage on a medium cooldown. So this is going to be a very popular skill, especially in hardcore, because anything that makes you fully immune to damage is going to be incredibly strong. And actually the enchantment effect for this specific skill, I think is going to be probably one of the strongest things for specifically hardcore characters, because if you put this skill in an enchantment slot, it will give you the effect that Flame Shield automatically activates when you take lethal damage. And this can only happen once every 120 seconds. So this means every 2 minutes, you can take fatal damage as a hardcore character, and instead of dying, you get Flame Shield that makes you immune to damage for 2 seconds. Ridiculously strong. I would probably expect almost every hardcore sorcerer's build to probably be using this. And an upgrade is Flame Shield grants 25% movement speed while active. So now you get a pretty big movement speed buff to just move away from enemies much more easily while being immune to try to reposition yourself to get yourself out of pretty sticky situations. And next up, we have Conjuration Skills, and these are primarily going to be focused around summoning something to help you in combat, usually being a filler between your basic and core skills, but these are also incredibly strong, and we saw even with the public beta that some of these skills ended up dealing the most damage in your build if you were built around them. And an example is Hydra, mana cost of 20, lucky hit chance of 77%, summon a 3-headed Hydra for 12 seconds. Each head spits fire at enemies dealing damage. Maximum of 1 Hydra can be active at a time. And also, like we went over, a lot of the passive effects from your enchantment system can also affect your other skills. So like we went over with the Fireball enchantment, anytime you kill something, they explode in an AoE, and Hydra would proc that, which like mentioned created basically the strongest build in the beta. And an upgrade of this is while healthy, your cast of Hydra gain 1 additional head. And healthy is just being above 80% health. So now when you're above 80% health, your Hydra is just going to be dealing a lot more damage with that 4th head, adding a little bit of gameplay around casting your Hydras. And next up, we have the Mastery category, and these are going to be somewhat similar to the Horror skill category. I would kind of think of these as a much bigger AoE versions of core skills, but generally they're not going to deal as much single target damage, and they're usually going to also be built around applying some additional effects. So for an example, we have Blizzard, mana cost of 40, lucky chance of 33%, summon a frigid blizzard that deals pretty massive damage and continually chills enemies over 8 seconds. So you're just casting this massive frost AoE, deals pretty good damage over time, but also continuously slows enemies. And that slow could potentially build up into a freeze. And an upgrade of this is Blizzard deal 25% increased damage to frozen enemies. So now this is going to be very good if you're a full frost build and have a lot of ways to freeze enemies. So you're going to be able to cast this big AoE that continuously chills everything. Then you want to be freezing all the enemies in this to do a lot more damage and just keep them stuck in this big blizzard that's just dealing big damage over time. And then finally, we have ultimate skills, and you're only going to be able to use one of these at a time. You're going to have big cooldowns, but they're going to be very, very strong. And an example is Deep Freeze, 60-second cooldown, lucky hit chance of 5%. Encase yourself in ice, becoming immune for 4 seconds, so fully immune to damage, continually dealing damage and chilling enemies over time. When Deep Freeze expires, it deals an additional massive amount of damage, and you can recast Deep Freeze to cancel it early. So basically what this does, it encases yourself in ice for 4 seconds, you continuously deal damage and chill enemies around you in a really big radius while it's active. Then when it breaks, it does a massive burst of AoE damage. So this is not only going to allow you to AoE freeze targets, but you're also going to become immune while doing it, and then you're just going to deal this massive chunk of damage at the end that just destroys everything. And they've actually shown this off because this is a bit more of a unique skill and looks really cool when using it. And an upgrade for this is when Deep Freeze ends, gain 10% of your base life as a barrier for 6 seconds for each enemy you froze while it was active. So again, you're constantly dealing damage when this is active, chilling enemies. That chill is going to build up into a freeze. So now for every enemy you freeze, you gain 10% of your base life as a defensive barrier when coming out of this, meaning even when this ends, it's going to be a very strong defensive skill. And then there is one last category called the Capstone category. Now, this doesn't house any active skills, but you get to choose one very strong passive effect. And an example is Shatter. After freeze expires, enemies explode for 25% of the damage you dealt to them while frozen. Now, this capstone is actually pretty ridiculous, not only in terms of actual power, but in terms of changing how you're going to play your build. Because this is obviously going to want to be played with all frost skills with a lot of freeze buildup. But now, after you freeze enemies, you want to deal as much damage possible to them while frozen, because then when that freeze ends, they're going to blow up doing AoE damage based off of the amount of damage you dealt to them while frozen, meaning you could potentially just have these massive AoE pops just dealing massive amounts of damage. And then finally, we have Paragon boards. Now, I don't want to go over all the different information on these boards, but I did want to go over the legendary nodes located in all of your different boards, because this will give you a good idea of what that specific board is focused on. So first, we have Burning Instinct. Your burning damage is increased by 40% of your critical strike damage, further increased by 5% for every 20 intelligence you have. Now, this passive seems kind of ridiculous, because not only is your burning damage going to be pretty heavily increased by your critical strike damage, so you're going to want to be stacking that up, but it's also increasing more for every 20 intelligence you have, making this a technically infinite scaling skill, even though you obviously can't get infinite intelligence, but a very high intelligence build with a lot of critical strike damage is just going to make your burns deal ridiculous damage. So having a burn focused fire build specifically built around this node, I think could be pretty ridiculous. And then we have Ceaseless Conduit. Crackling energy has a 25% chance to not consume a charge when triggered. Crackling energy's damage is increased by 2% for every 20 intelligence you have. So again, technically infinite scaling based off of your intelligence, and crackling energy is an effect that comes from your lightning skills, and different lightning skills and effect can spawn this little crackling energy on the ground. When you walk over it and pick it up, it gives you a charge. I think you can hold 12 charges at baseline, and these charges will just randomly be used up, and it'll send out this lightning attack using up those charges. But now this has a chance to not use up any of those charges, and there's a lot of additional effects that affect just crackling lightning. So some will make it be an AoE attack, some will make it be bigger, do more damage, stuff like that. So a crackling energy build could be pretty interesting. And then we have Elemental Summoner. Your Conjuration skills have a 10% reduced cooldown or mana cost per Conjuration skill you have equipped. So this is actually pretty unique, because I haven't seen any other effects on classes that want you to use a bunch of the same skill category at a time. And again, Conjuration were these skills that you summon something to help you in combat. So a Hydra, there was also one that summoned blades that help you in combat. So using a bunch of these is just going to be very strong. So this one node has the potential to make a full Conjuration build possible. And then next up, we have Enchantment Master. Your enchantments are 20% stronger. Now this node itself is pretty boring, but very strong. And like I mentioned, the enchantment system is deceptively complex just because of some of the interactions you can cause just by having certain skills in those enchantment slots and how they interact with your other skills. And then next up, we have Frigid Fate. Dealing cold damage to vulnerable enemies increases your lucky hit chance by 1% for 5 seconds up to 15%. So if you're using a cold build where you can easily apply vulnerable, you're now going to be getting a lot of lucky hit on top of that. And this can be very strong, but this is probably something you're going to need a pretty focused and endgame build to use correctly, because you're going to need a cold focused build that can apply vulnerable easily and is also focused on lucky hit with very good lucky hit effects. You're going to need all of that to make this node worthwhile, but into the end game, there's probably going to be some very strong builds that can accommodate all that. And then we have Icefall. Killing a frozen enemy grants you 15% of your maximum life as a barrier for 5 seconds. So again, if you're focused on a freezing build, you can continuously be getting this new barrier every time you kill a frozen enemy that can help you be much more tanky. And then we have Searing Heat. Casting Fireball or Meteor increases the critical strike chance of further cast of that skill by 5% for 5 seconds up to 15%. Additional stacks do not refresh this timer. So this is going to be a skill if you're focusing on either Fireball or Meteor, constantly increasing its critical strike chance, but like this mentioned, it doesn't refresh the timer. So it's not like you stack this up a couple times and it keeps refreshing. You have to keep using those skills to keep getting new stacks. And then finally, we have Static Surge. Stunning close enemies restores 10 mana. And this is pretty basic as well, but like we went over, even one of your enchantment slots causes you to stun enemies around you every time you use a cooldown. So with this, you're potentially turning every cooldown into a mana restoring ability. And this is one of those nodes that's not as strong as some of the others, but this could be used in quite a lot of builds just because it could potentially restore ridiculous amounts of mana for every build. So having looked at this overview of the Sorceress, I think this is probably going to be one of, if not the most popular class in Diablo 4, especially on launch. The Sorcerer is just a very strong at low level, so it's going to be very easy to level up, and I think it just has a lot of complex interactions. It's going to be very fun to play with into the end game, and you just have so many different tools and big AoE damage for the Sorceress, so I think it's going to be a very popular class. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.